Almost 40 years ago, the largest nuclear disaster in human history occurred. A massive amount of radiation, 400 times greater than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, spread across the atmosphere, threatening the survival of all of Europe. The dead zone covered an area of up to 2,600 square kilometers. Cancer deaths, genetic mutations, and countless other consequences followed. What exactly happened? At 11 p.m. on April 25, 1986, at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant in Pripyat, northern Ukraine, a catastrophe was unfolding. The plant had been built in the early 1970s when Soviet leaders set out to create a massive energy network stretching from the Gulf of Finland to the Caspian Sea, with an investment of nearly 400 million rubles. From the moment construction began, Chernobyl was predicted to become the largest nuclear power complex in the world, a symbol of Soviet state pride. By early 1983, 4 RBMK reactor units had risen from the grasslands and swamps over 100 kilometers from the capital, Kyiv. RBMK was a second-generation nuclear reactor, more powerful than any reactor in the West. Each unit could generate 1,000 megawatts of electricity, enough to supply over 1 million Soviet households simultaneously. That night, while reactor units 1, 2, and 3 were still operating at full capacity, the operators at Reactor 4 were reducing power in preparation for a safety test. The goal was to determine whether, in the event of a power outage, the residual electricity in the reactors could keep the cooling system running until backup generators started. However, a critical issue lay in the fact that the plant's chief engineer had approved the test without reporting it to higher authorities. Few knew that despite being considered absolutely safe, the Chernobyl plant had dangerous flaws. The RBMK reactor had the highest positive void coefficient of any nuclear reactor ever built. In simple terms, this meant that the fission process in the reactors could become unstable or even uncontrollable when operating at low power. Astonishingly, Soviet nuclear safety regulators and the reactor's designers at d.ea.d ignored this flaw. They covered up design defects and workforce quality issues, essentially creating a ticking time bomb under the illusion that the clock would never count down to zero. At Reactor 4, workers were ordered to reduce power from 3,200 megawatts to 700 megawatts. Then, at around 12:30 a.m., disaster began to unfold. The power level unexpectedly dropped to just 30 megawatts. Seeing that electricity output was far lower than expected, Anatoly Dyatlov, the plant's deputy chief engineer, who had 14 years of experience working in Soviet naval reactors in the Far East, ordered workers to remove some control rods to speed up the reaction. Even after doing so, the reactor's power only rose to 200 megawatts by 1 a.m. Dyatlov then issued another order: remove even more control rods. Normally, the reactor had 211 control rods, but by this point, only 7 remained. This was a severe violation of safety protocols, which clearly stated that at least 15 control rods must always remain inside the reactor. At this moment, the reactor's power output began skyrocketing. The nuclear reaction accelerated exponentially. The remaining water in the core rapidly turned to steam, and there was no longer enough coolant. Pressure within the reactor surged. Shock waves were felt throughout the building. Workers realized they needed to execute an emergency shutdown. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, shift supervisor Sasha Akamov gave the order to press the scram button, AZ-5. Pressing this button meant that all control rods would be reinserted to slow the reaction. But due to a long-standing design flaw, the moment the rods entered the reactor, its power output spiked to an extreme 33,000 megawatts, 10 times the normal level. A small explosion occurred within seconds of pressing the emergency button. The core of Reactor 4 began to melt. Just 2 to 3 seconds later, a second, far more powerful explosion followed, estimated to have the force of 225 tons of TNT. The nearly 1,000-ton reactor cap was blown into the air. 2 workers were killed instantly. Around 25% of the glowing hot graphite and superheated fuel channel materials were ejected. Due to corruption, the reactor was only partially enclosed by walls at the time of the explosion. In the control room, Geiger counters, electronic instruments used to measure radiation, became stuck at 3.6 roentgens, a reading mistakenly believed to be safe. At 1:25 a.m., fire alarms blared. Firefighting teams from Chernobyl and Pripyat were urgently dispatched. 7 minutes after the explosion, the 1st Fire Brigade arrived at the scene. 28 firefighters, under the command of Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, immediately began spraying water on the flames. More firefighting groups soon arrived. General Telyatnikov led the overall operation. A total of 69 personnel and 14 units of equipment were deployed. They believed it was just an ordinary fire, unaware of the deadly radiation levels. As a result, they lacked protective gear, no gas masks, only gloves, helmets, and tattered cloths. At 2:30 a.m., Brukhanov, the plant director, ordered all relevant departments to convene in the underground bunker of the administrative building. First, he sent an encrypted message to the Ministry of Energy, stating there had been a radiation accident. He also reported the situation to superiors in Moscow and local leaders. With the support of Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin, he then ordered operators to restore the cooling system, unaware that the reactor had been completely destroyed, a futile and meaningless effort. Even after a staff member reported that radiation levels had maxed out at 200 roentgens per hour on a military dosimeter, Brukhanov dismissed it, blaming the government for supplying defective equipment. At 3 a.m., he contacted Vladimir Marin, the Communist Party official in charge of nuclear issues in Moscow, falsely claiming the situation was under control. The officials in the emergency meeting agreed that everything was safe. The city would be isolated, and phone lines would be cut to prevent the spread of misleading news. They were gravely mistaken. Outside, firefighters began experiencing burns and nausea. Of the 13 hospitalized in Moscow, 11 died, including Volodymyr Pravik and General Telyatnikov. The radiation was so intense that Vladimir Pravik's eye color changed from brown to blue. By 4 a.m., after hours of effort, the fire was localized. By 6 a.m., it was completely extinguished. Yet, residents remained oblivious to the imminent danger. Radiation had contaminated the food they ate, the water they drank, schools, parks, and even the firewood they burned to keep warm. Unusual symptoms started appearing, and hospitals became overcrowded. The situation worsened. On the night of April 26, a government investigation team arrived at the site, led by Valery Legasov, deputy director of the Institute of Atomic Energy, and Boris Cherbyna, deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers. It was only then that the true global threat of the disaster was revealed. Radiation readings had reached 15,000 roentgens, an absolutely terrifying number. At 2 p.m. the next day, 36 hours after the explosion, an emergency evacuation order was issued. 115,000 people fled their homes. The once bustling city was reduced to a ghost town. Amid Cold War tensions, the Soviet government attempted to cover up the incident. They did not want the world to know what had happened in Chernobyl. But deception was futile. Unlike the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in World War II, this disaster was like a massive, dirty bomb, spreading immense radioactive pollution. A radioactive cloud from the burning reactor carried iodine and cesium across Europe. Fallout reached Belarus and Sweden, where radiation monitoring stations detected abnormally high levels. By analyzing wind patterns, they traced the source back to the USSR, forcing the Soviet government to publicly acknowledge the disaster on April 28. The world was in shock. Though the fires at Chernobyl had been contained, heat and radiation continued to radiate. Cracks began to appear in the reactor's foundation. The underground water reservoir was filling with radioactive waste. If it evaporated and built up pressure, a third explosion could occur. Soviet physicists calculated that such an explosion would vaporize the remaining 3 reactors, devastate Kiev, contaminate the water supply for 30 million people, and render much of Europe uninhabitable for hundreds of thousands of years. There was only one way to prevent this. Someone had to dive into the flooded basement and drain the radioactive water. They say heroes emerge in times of crisis. Firefighters had battled the blaze for hours. Doctors risked their lives to treat the injured. Now, 3 heroes had to step forward. 6 days after the explosion, at a worker assembly, Deputy Prime Minister Cherbyna announced, "We need 3 men who know the basement structure to go down and complete a vital mission. You will be rewarded with substantial compensation and a lifetime pension of 400 rubles per year." But no one was tempted by this deal. They all knew it was a death sentence. Then Cherbyna issued a chilling warning. "If this mission isn't carried out, millions will die, including your wives and children." His words struck a nerve. 3 men stepped forward: Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bespalov, and Boris Baranov. Wearing only wetsuits and carrying flashlights, they plunged into the dark, radioactive waters. Even when their flashlights failed, they navigated by touch and successfully opened the valves. 20,000 tons of radioactive water were drained, perhaps a miracle. All three survived with no severe long-term health effects. 9 days after the explosion, containment and mitigation efforts continued. One strategy involved digging a massive tunnel beneath the reactor to install a cooling system to prevent the core from melting into groundwater. The only people capable of this task were miners. The Minister of Coal Industry traveled to Donbass and Tula, 120 miles south of Moscow, to recruit 400 workers for a top-secret mission. When they resisted, the authorities threatened them with forced labor. "If you don't tell us why, we're not going," the miners responded. Finally, the truth was revealed. The reactor's fuel will seep into the earth, contaminating water from Kiev to the Black Sea, affecting tens of millions. "We need you to stop it." Realizing the stakes, over 400 miners volunteered. They weren't seeking death, they were trying to save lives. Working in extreme heat, high radiation, and poor air conditions, without proper protective gear, they completed their task in 3 weeks. However, many later suffered severe health consequences. Some reports estimate that around 100 miners died from acute radiation sickness or cancer. It took over 10 days to bring the Chernobyl crisis under initial control. Helicopters were deployed to drop thousands of tons of clay, sand, boron, and lead onto the reactor. This was a dangerous task. One helicopter crashed, killing 4 pilots. Over 600 pilots risked their lives to stop the radiation from spreading. The next step to clean up the radioactive waste left by the Soviet Union, remote-controlled robots were used. However, in the harsh environmental conditions, they were severely damaged. In the end, only humans could save their own future. More than 600,000 people from around the world were mobilized to mitigate the consequences, despite the immeasurable dangers. To meet Ukraine's energy demands, the Chernobyl power plant and its reactors continued to operate until the year 2000. After that, a dismantling plan was put in place, with the process expected to be completed by 2028. The entire power plant, the ghost towns of Pripyat and Chernobyl, and a 1,000-square-mile exclusion zone have been restricted to most people, except for scientists, government officials, and liquidators working to clean up the remaining aftermath. The severe consequences of the Chernobyl disaster continue to impact people. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Health Organization, and the United Nations Cancer Research Agency have concluded that the negative effects of the nuclear accident will last for centuries. While the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC, estimates the direct and indirect death toll at around 160,000, Ukraine's Radiation Commission suggests the number could be as high as 500,000, and this figure is still rising, particularly in Ukraine and Belarus, due to cancer, blood disorders, and genetic mutations. Environmental impact. Immediately after the Chernobyl radiation leak, a 30-kilometers radius around the plant was completely abandoned by humans. Nature reclaimed the area, and large animals such as wolves, deer, lynxes, eagles, and wild boars have been found inhabiting the zone. It is believed that radiation may have caused genetic mutations and deformities in wildlife. Here, we will examine some of the horrifying images believed to be consequences of the Chernobyl disaster. According to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, the damaged reactor was hastily sealed in a concrete sarcophagus designed to contain the remaining radiation. However, there is still intense scientific debate over the long-term effectiveness of this containment structure. In 2011, Ukraine opened the Chernobyl exclusion zone to tourists, allowing visitors to witness firsthand the aftermath of the worst nuclear disaster in history. A dark theory behind the disaster. There are some extremely dark theories about what happened on April 26, 1986. One controversial claim suggests that the Chernobyl nuclear explosion was orchestrated to justify Ukraine's separation from the Soviet Union. In 2013, Ukraine and Europe were shocked when Professor Nikola Kravchuk, a renowned Ukrainian nuclear physicist, published a book exposing an alleged conspiracy behind the Chernobyl disaster. The 103-page book, titled The Mystery of the Chernobyl Accident, asserts that the reactor explosion was premeditated and executed under the direct orders of Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader who initiated the perestroika reforms that were heavily promoted at the time. The supposed goal was to create a legitimate reason for Ukraine to break away from the Soviet Union, paving the way for the USSR's collapse, something that the West had long desired. History has shown that this alleged scheme ultimately led to Ukraine becoming the largest nation to secede from the Soviet state within 5 years. Professor Kravchuk conducted an in-depth analysis from a purely technical and professional perspective, highlighting the irreparable errors that resulted in the catastrophic explosion of Reactor No. 4. He also refuted the official conclusion by the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, which placed blame on the plant's management and operators. Do you find this explanation convincing for what happened at Chernobyl in 1986? Let us know your thoughts.